And joining us now in studio, there's Janice Stein, TVO's own foreign affairs analyst and director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. I'm going to show you a map you've probably shown your students hundreds of times over the course of your professorial life. Go ahead, Michael. Let's put this up if we can. Here's the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. We're talking Turkey tonight. Today's Turkish people are, of course, descendants of those who commanded the Ottoman Empire. And at the peak in the 17th century, the empire covered huge areas of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And there's Turkey today. Much smaller, but still a fascinating place, particularly as we discuss the tug of East and West. Let's start with this, Janice. What does the Ottoman period tell us about Turkey's relations with other countries today?
The Ottoman Empire is an absolutely crucial period to understand if you want to understand some of the tensions today. Turks ruled over non-Turkic speaking peoples. So in the Arab Middle East, there is more than lingering resentment against the Turks for that 300-year period of rule. Both Muslims, so people tend to ignore the differences, but really important, Steve, and that's still true today.
All Muslims, but Turks are non-Arab Muslims.
But Turks are non-Arab.
That's significant?
It's very important because the Arabs perceived Ottoman rule as alien, foreign, imperial, words that we actually hear used very often against European imperial powers. But in many parts of the Arab world, the way they still today view the Turks.
It's been almost 100 years. They still see it that way.
Historical memories are very long.
The land of the camel, as they say.
That's exactly right.
Over the past few generations, how do you think the Turks have viewed themselves in as much as they straddle both Europe and Asia?
That's, you know, I think in many ways Turkey's the most interesting country in the world to watch. It is, on the map that you showed us, it is just on the borderline between Europe and Asia. It looks south to the Middle East. So Turkey encompasses all the global currents. The last 15 years have been particularly interesting. The Europeans, in a sense, extended a hand to Turkey and said, we'll think about having you join the European Union, but, first you have to meet our standards. You have to meet our standards on human rights. You have to meet our standards on liberalization. And a process started in Turkey where Turkey, which is a NATO member, so already had deep Western affiliations, nevertheless looked toward Europe, opened up its politics, engaged a whole series of economic and political reforms, thinking it would join the EU. Well, the Europeans, led by Sarkozy and others, fundamentally said, no way, Turkey is not Christian, and the European Union cannot absorb 70 million Muslims.
Well, here was the quote. This now, admittedly, this comes from the year 2004, but the quote was, Turkey is not part of Europe and will never be a part of Europe. That was Herman van Rompuy,
right,
who is now, he holds the EU presidency today.
He holds the EU presidency, and he very much reflects European thinking both in Germany and in France, the two countries who have been most vocal about their opposition.
Now, Turks obviously didn't like hearing that.
Well, and let's understand what it's about, right? It's not that they're Turkish, it's that they're Muslim. And this represents the European perspective that Europe is Christian.
But is he right insofar as Turkey, in many respects, is a better fit, if I can put it that way, in the Middle East or in the East than it is in what we traditionally think of as Western Europe?
Well, I actually think that's wrong. First of all, Turkey underwent its own Kemalist revolution from 1923 on. This was the most aggressive so-called secular revolution. The only people who are as aggressively and militantly secular during this period are the French with laïcité.
Sure.
So actually, I would say the closest parallels are between Turkey and France. Secondly, this was a huge missed opportunity for Europe to build bridges to a very important part of the world. And what does this really say? It really says that the Europeans think of the European Union as Christian. So we can possibly imagine part of the Balkans sliding in, Bosnia along with other parts of former Yugoslavia, but no significant Muslim country can be admitted to the European Union. This tells us something very fundamental about the European project.
And you're saying fundamental, but you mean negative.
I do.
Yeah. Turkey's diplomatic arm at least you hear this in foreign policy circles, is increasingly muscular these days.
It
If
is.
there's less welcome to the idea of Turkey joining the EU, why does Turkey appear to be more muscular on the foreign policy front?
There's one other piece in this quick story about Turkey, which is the coming to power of an Islamist party in Turkey by democratic means, through fair and free and open democratic elections, which is something the European Union, the United States, many other Western powers celebrate. And this is the most interesting experiment to watch as Erdogan, the prime minister, has navigated being a religious party, Islamic, but nevertheless very committed to democratic values.
Islamic or Islamist?
Well, I call it Islamic because this is a modern form of Islam, which nevertheless says we are Muslim, our democracy reflects our Muslim values. And he has turned to the Arab world increasingly, and probably the part of the story people know best is the explosion with Israel. There had been quite a collaborative relationship. That went up in smoke.
With the flotilla.
With the
Gaza and all that.
flotilla. And there is an open attempt now by the Turkish government to repair long-standing relationships in the Arab world and to deepen their ties, to reach out to Iran. Turkey argues that it's uniquely equipped to moderate between the Western world and Tehran.
And do you think they are?
They certainly have lines into the Iranian regime. They are less, the Iranian regime is less suspicious of Turkey than it is of the European powers. But in fact, the Turkish government really has not been able to deliver anything and has made no progress on that file whatsoever.
Now, a huge story in Israel, although it hasn't had much play over here, is the fires they've been having lately.
Yes.
More than 40 people killed in
Yes.
those fires.
Yes.
And for the first time, maybe ever, the Israelis have had to ask the neighbors for help.
Yes, they did.
Including, and Turkey has offered.
Turkey
Does
actually...
this offer a possibility of a reconciliation between these two?
You know, it's really interesting because Turkey almost didn't wait to be asked. It offered assistance, and it offered assistance in language that would be familiar to us too. It said, this is humanitarian. This transcends divisions. So this doesn't send a signal about our political dispute with Israel over the raid on the flotilla, but we are humanitarian. And in fact, right now, Israel and Turkey are at work on a document designed to offer the Turks the apology without the apology.
How do you know this?
There are representatives of Turkey and representatives of Israel who work in this country, and those negotiations are progressing. There will be extensive compensation by Israel of the families in Turkey who lost relatives. The real sticking point here is apology versus regret. We're down to that.
Gotcha. Okay. Is Turkey, in your view, flexing these muscles on the diplomatic stage because they bring something particularly special to bear, or is it more a case of there's a power vacuum in the world right now, and so they're filling it?
Well, it's three things, I think. And I think it's important to recognize all three. One, they're really annoyed at the Europeans. They were led a dance. And it's interesting because you hear divisions among Turkish officials. Some of them are glad the experiment took 10 years because it led to a series of reforms and a reining in of the avowedly secular but nevertheless Turkish military that has intervened so often in Turkish politics. But they're annoyed at the Europeans, false promise, right? Secondly, as I said, the Turks have this unique vantage point. They're at the crossroads of the world. That's what your map shows. And three, the big powers are busy with global economic recessions. Countries like Brazil, India, Turkey, Indonesia are now speaking with a much louder voice.
But nothing in this world is forever. So while the door to the EU appears to be closed for the immediate future, can you say it really is closed, say, for the next 10, 20 years?
I think it's probably closed for the next decade. If you actually, the visceral opposition, and I know we will talk about this later in the show, Steve, but it's tied up as well with large Turkish communities in Germany and the larger problem, so-called, of Muslims in Europe, which is exacerbating that problem. And the Europeans talk in language which evokes fear of being swamped, which is frankly just nonsense.
Okay, let me follow up on this potential Middle Eastern role that it can play here, though. We started our conversation by your having said, in the land of the camel, people have long memories and they haven't forgotten what the Ottomans did to them 100
Right.
years ago.
Right.
The Arabs I'm talking about now. And yet, you think, and I gather the Turks think, they do have a role to play in bringing the Arabs to at least some part of the negotiating table.
They do.
How's this?
You know, it was, for instance, Turkey played a role mediated between Syria and Israel, and was quite successful at it just until everything blew apart over Gaza. And so the Turks were more acceptable to the Syrians in some sense, the United States, a Muslim country, although not Arab, and more acceptable to Israel, not Arab, but regionally rooted. Very similar kind of dynamic with Iran. And Turkey has very skilled leadership that understands how important it is in the world right now. It also is a booming economy with a growth rate that exceeds Europe and the United States, and will probably for the next 4 or 5 years considered one of the, just behind the BRICS in terms of the economic potential that it has.
And a hotspot for tourism for, what, the last 20 years anyway?
A
from
hotspot for
Western
tourism
places.
for the last 1,000 years.
Well,
frankly.
for sure. One last thing before we get the others to join us as well. Should we be concerned about the prospect of an eastward-looking Turkey playing a greater role in the Middle East?
I don't think we should be concerned. I think Turkey is going to look east, it's going to look west, it's going to look south, and it's going to look north. But I think Europeans really have to ask themselves, are they slamming the door on Turkey with all that message implies about their relationship with the larger Muslim world? That is a big question, and I think it's the question that in many ways will be defining of the future between Europe and the Middle East.